Food insecurity has been on the rise now for the last 6 years, with the number of people facing starvation rising from 80 million to 135 million today. COVID-19, the Russian invasion of Ukraine come as tremendous stress points, disrupting supply chains and also sending us now into a new inflationary cycle. Welcome to you all, and welcome to the European Centre for International Political Economy. My name is Emily Rees, and it's a great pleasure to be with you today to discuss whether open markets can effectively tackle food insecurity. I am honoured to introduce you to a lineup of exceptional experts to debate this issue. A big welcome first to Doa Abdel-Mattal, an agriculture, environment and climate expert and senior counselor in the World Trade Organization, where she's responsible for relations with external stakeholders and international organizations, including the OECD, World Bank, FAO, G20, amongst so many others. And I believe many of those stakeholders are on today's call. Doa is the founder of the WTO Trade Dialogues on Food, a series of events that was launched in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. She is Egyptian and Swiss, and it's not the first time she serves at the WTO. Doa served as an advisor to Pascal Lamy when he was Director General, and she not only holds a PhD in development studies from the University of Geneva, but is also read in environmental studies from Cambridge. Welcome, Doa. John Clark is a well-known figure here in Brussels, where he is Director for International Relations and Trade Negotiations at the European Commission's Directorate General for Agriculture. John is responsible, amongst others, for negotiating the agricultural market access clauses in the EU's free trade agreements and for multilateral negotiations relating to food in the WTO, amongst others. He joined the Commission in the 90s as a trade negotiator and has headed the EU delegation to the World Trade Organization and the United Nations in Geneva. Prior to this, John embraced an Indo-Pacific career in the government of Hong Kong, where he headed, amongst others, the governor's cabinet. Tatiana Palermo, you're joining us from Washington, where she resides. Tatiana served as Secretary for International Relations at the Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture and has also served as Brazil's Chief Agricultural Trade Negotiator. And so at a given time, she was John's counterpart. Tatiana has sat on the boards of Brazil's Federal Agricultural Research Institution, Embrapa, the National Food Supply Company, CONAB, and the Brazilian Trade and Investment Agency. Tatiana is also a joint Russian and Brazilian national. Her family is from Ukraine and has studied and practiced private law in Russia before gaining her LLM here in the EU in the Netherlands. Tatiana is an authority on food security and writes a regular column for Gazeta do Povo in Brazil on macroeconomic trends and international trade. Welcome. Simon, we're delighted to have you with us today. Simon has taught pretty much every trade negotiator in the world, international trade and economic development at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. He's specialized in how governments tilt the commercial playing field in favor of local firms. So that expertise will probably be of great relevance in today's discussion. Simon, you're also the founder of the St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade, the institutional home of the Global Trade Alert, a tool used by so many trade professionals worldwide, especially when we see waves of restrictions as we're seeing today. Simon holds his PhD in economics from Yale University and has written over 200 articles, book chapters and volumes alongside teaching at the universities of Michigan, Oxford, Rutgers, and Johns Hopkins. What a lineup. Welcome to you all. Reminding everybody who is following us online and who is also in the room today that if you would like to ask any question to any of our speakers, just pop your question into the chat function, and we will get to as many of them as possible. But let's kick off here. First, let's look at food security per se and the weaponization of food. Russia has been shelling ports, polluting soils, bombing silos, and pilfering Ukrainian grain. And the World Food Programme now predicts that the conflict in Ukraine will see acute hunger increased by 47 million people, with Sub Saharan Africa most at risk. Developed countries, such as the countries here in the European Union, also run the risk of seeing the most vulnerable in society falling into the trap of food insecurity, not due to the lack of access, but due to affordability. So allow me to kick off straight away. Simon, Ukraine and Russia play an outsized role in global markets for key crops. Could you kick us off here, providing us with an overview of the countries most affected by this conflict in terms of food supply? Is there really evidence that Russia is proactively weaponizing food as part of this war? And what do you think are the risks of a protracted conflict for food security?
So thanks for having me, Emily. Let's get straight to the stats on the wheat trade, which is by far one of the biggest ones which Ukraine and Russia contribute to. About 30 net food importing countries buy 30% or more of their food, of their wheat, from Russia and Ukraine. Those countries, as you said earlier, very heavily focused in Sub Saharan Africa, but we mustn't forget the Middle East as well, where there are some key countries like Egypt, Lebanon, and we must also remember some of the CIS region countries are very dependent. So there's a clear developing country angle to this, which is extremely serious. The restrictions on exporting fertilizer, which are also there, have a big impact on a lot of least developed countries and African nations as well. And you can find at least a dozen of them who I think have got 40% or more of their sourcing comes from Russia in this respect. And so the fertilizer, of course, will have a second round effect on the amount of food that these countries can grow themselves, not just what they import. And I think that's a really important point. As for the weaponization, it's a bit hard to argue that it's not being weaponized, given what we're seeing with the inability of Ukraine to be able to ship its own wheat out from Odessa and places like this. So there is a case to be argued a case to be answered in the case of Russia. Last point on knock-on effects from this. We've seen with the rising food prices and lack of availability of food, this often spills over into political instability. You may have seen the analysis 2 weeks ago in The Economist, where they sort of simulated which countries are most likely to see social unrest. They highlighted Egypt, Turkmenistan, and also Bangladesh as seeing they expect double the number of social unrest incidents happening, and much of Africa, Middle East and North Africa, and again the CIS region, seeing big upticks. So there will be a political fallout from this. That instability may trigger migration, and so I think there's be a whole cascade of undesirable knock-on effects, which is why we've got to settle this problem.
Thank you, Simon. I mean, you mentioned the MENA region, one that is really in the neighborhood of the EU, and the potential for social unrest. When we saw that a couple of years ago, when there was the 2008-2009 crisis, particularly in places such as Egypt, which brings me to Noah, not from an Egyptian perspective, but from that of the WTO. I mean, for the past 6 years, the number of people marching towards food security has been on a constant rise. As we've been saying, it's not particular to this situation. This is an aggravating situation. And so shouldn't countries seek food independence to build resilience rather than be so dependent on trade?
Thank you very much, Emily, for the question, and hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here. This is an extremely important dialogue. Emily, the short answer to your question is no. Countries should not seek food independence. So let me give now the longer answer. The main regions where there is food insecurity are conflict zones. So I think it's important for us to be aware of this. They are the zones that the World Food Programme refers to as hotspots. So the main reason for very serious food insecurity in the world has nothing to do either with a shortage of food or with trade in food. It's political and economic access to food in conflict-ridden areas. In fact, we conducted a very interesting exercise with the World Food Programme many years ago, where the WTO and the World Food Programme juxtaposed the maps of where they operate. And we found that where the WFP works is where there are no functioning markets, where there is no functioning international trade or regional, and sometimes not even local. So, now, in terms of food independence is fiction. It's fiction because some countries cannot survive without imported food. Gulf Arab countries import 80 to 90% of their food, shift more in the direction of Asia. Singapore, 80 to 90% of its food is imported, move to another continent. Haiti, 30 to 40% of its food is imported. Some countries can simply not survive without imported food. Where countries find themselves on the map is an accident of geography. Countries need to cooperate to share food. Second, today, our food is produced through global value chains. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, 1/3 of all agricultural commodities cross borders at least twice. Our food is not made in any particular country anymore. It is assembled in, just as cars and iPhones and washing machines are. I take the barf chocolate example always because I live in Switzerland. The cocoa comes from probably Côte d'Ivoire. The milk would probably come from New Zealand, the Netherlands, the US. The sugar would probably come from Brazil, Thailand, India. The nuts and the other flavorings would probably come from yet another location. Our food is assembled in the world. The idea of going independent is fiction. Finally, we live in one planet. We share the same planet. Agriculture is 40% of the world's land surface area, 70% of its fresh water use, with a very substantial impact and environmental footprint, in particular greenhouse emissions. And we can't tackle those transboundary impacts without cooperating. So the idea that we can go independent on agriculture and on food is simply fiction. And I'll stop here, Emily.
Thank you so much, Doa. So food independence is a fiction. Maybe touching upon that point, you mentioned all these countries that have that are food net importers. It's estimated today that around 80% of the world's population live in countries which are net importers of food. And turning to you, Tatiana, you've long argued to the importance of stepping up agricultural productivity and liberalizing trade to feed this growing world population. But again, coming back to this trade element, isn't the world's over-reliance on Ukrainian and Russian food supply pointing us towards the need to reduce trade dependencies to build food security?
Thank you, Emily. It's a great question. But first, I would like to thank you for organizing this timely discussion. And it's a great honor and pleasure to be here to join this panel with such distinguished colleagues. Back to your question, and I will repeat a little bit what Doa said. When we talk about food supply, friendshoring or nearshoring is not really an option. We cannot significantly reduce trade dependence, as most of the world population, as you said, lives in countries that are net importers of food. To them, trade is vital, and undisrupted trade is vital. Open markets are vital. And countries that are dependent on Ukrainian and Russian supplies that Simon mentioned will have to source this supply from somewhere else, right? It will take a joint effort, and I agree with Doa on this, of all major food exporters, European Union, United States, Brazil, China, and others to feed the countries that depend on Russia and Ukraine. A global effort will be needed to reduce trade disruptions, to stabilize and decrease the food prices that are record high, and reduce excessive volatility. And when we look beyond the current situation aggravated by the war, we still need to produce over 40% more of food in less than 30 years. Even if we reduce losses and waste that today account for 1/3 of the production. If not, we will have to produce even more. Some numbers are showing 50 or 60%. As most of arable land reserves are located in South America, the world will be relying even more on trade. And yes, stepping up productivity with the use of technology and liberalizing trade are crucial for reducing food insecurity.
So moving to you, John, we've just heard from Tatiana, we need 40% more food production. And I wanted to come back to the Commission's communication on food security that outlined really that the EU's food supply is not at risk, but that the shock from the invasion of Ukraine has exposed vulnerabilities in the single market's food system. And we're at the moment here in the European Union where we're moving towards a model of agriculture that, while promoting better food sovereignty, I won't use the words food independence, on the continent, it is likely to yield lower yields, to result in lower yields. So is there not a risk here that the EU's food system transition negatively impact those developing countries that we've been mentioning that are dependent on its exports?
Well, I'll take a leaf out of Doa's book and say the short answer is no. And thank you, first of all, for inviting me to join you. It's a great pleasure. I'd like to challenge this claim that implementing the farm to fork strategy and moving to a more sustainable model of production will result in lower agricultural yields in Europe. I think studies that have made that claim have missed out at least three big elements. First of all, the role in the future of technology and innovation in the field, which will increase productivity. That's not been priced into the studies that look at or that point to lower yields. Secondly, reduction of food waste, that's mentioned by Tatiana just then. 20% of the food in Europe is wasted. So if we can achieve our target of halving food waste by 2030, that's tantamount to a 10% increase in the food supply. And thirdly, we'll be seeing changing consumer habits in the years ahead, away from meat to consumption of plant-based proteins, which means more protein productivity per hectare. And there's a more fundamental point that, if we don't move to a more sustainable model of agriculture in Europe, we'll have no agriculture at all in the long term. Our soil will be depleted, our water and air polluted, and climate change will continue its relentless march against our land. So we'll be sawing off the branch we're sitting on. Now, on the plight of the import-dependent countries, notably Africa, of course they face major challenges. The combined effect of COVID, climate change, population growth, urbanization, and the Russian invasion, all of those disrupting supply chains, leading to severe price hikes and more insecurity. I think this calls for, broadly speaking, a twofold response. First of all, in the short term, beyond humanitarian aid, is to increase the resilience of the food supply chain, keep trade open, and we're trying in our own way to do that. For example, through the creation of the solidarity lanes, so that wheat can get out of Ukraine, even though we cannot substitute for the lack of access of the Black Sea ports. But secondly, in the medium to long term, I think we need to step up support to import-dependent countries, especially in Africa, to invest in more local production so they are less vulnerable to external shocks. I fully take the points made by the two previous speakers that open trade, regional markets, global markets is all part of the resilience policy. But if you look at Africa, 50 years ago, it fed its own population. But since then, with climate change, environmental degradation, population growth, Africa is unduly, I think, dependent on imports and is therefore very vulnerable. So in the medium to long term, we need to step up efforts to encourage and help African countries be more more self-sufficient, not autarkic, but more self-sufficient. And we should not be relying upon exporting food to Africa, but rather exporting technology investment in agricultural domestic production, so that Africa can actually produce more itself of what it needs for its own countries and the African region more generally. You look, and there's enormous potential. The yields of rice, for example, in Africa are 1/4 of what they are in Southeast Asia. So there's enormous potential to help Africa to increase agricultural productivity as part of a general policy of resilience.
Thank you so much, John. I mean, now allow me to move to what's been happening since February, and particularly the wave of export restrictions that we've been seeing around the world. We're talking about, okay, creating more resilience, these long-term plans for countries to become more self-reliant. But ultimately, we have a crisis now, and that is leaving food-dependent countries scrambling to secure affordable food as their reserves plummet. And at the same time, we see the food exporters, the net exporters, restricting what they're putting out onto world markets at the time that we most need them. So, Simon, if I can turn to you first, you created the Global Trade Alert in 2009, which is the last time that we saw this big wave, the height of the financial crisis. And we saw at that time governments adopt very similar beggar thy neighbor policies. Today, we're estimating that around 16% of internationally traded calories, for lack of a better term, are subject to these export restrictions. So I'd like to ask you, what is the latest assessment, and what's motivating governments to take such measures? Is it not very short-termist? What are the longer-term impacts, and what have we learned or not learned from the last crisis?
So I checked the statistics this morning, and we have seen since the invasion of Ukraine, 86 export curbs on food and fertilizer put in place. 57 of them are still in force. They have been implemented mainly by countries in the conflict region, in Middle East and North Africa. We have seen, by the way, and also in South Asia, we've also seen quite a lot of restraint on export curbs in Sub Saharan Africa and Latin America. So there's the exception, not the rule there. So I want to highlight that there is a serious difference across countries in how they've responded. The other really important dimension is that lots of countries have liberalized trade on imported agricultural crops as well. So we've seen 83 import reforms put in place. So you're seeing, I think, some countries trying to tap into markets to import, and others restricting exports. Why do they restrict exports? Fear of the consequences of a hungry and starving population, in particular for political stability. Now, that standard answer now needs to be nuanced in the light of the experience in Indonesia with their palm oil export ban. Because what the Indonesians found is, once they put in place this export ban, the farmers of producing palm oil went out on the streets in large numbers and caused political instability. So the idea that you ban exports and you get a breathing space on political instability, I think, needs to be challenged in light of the Indonesian experience. You asked what happens in the longer term when countries use export curbs like this. the countries which have done so typically tend to depress the income of farmers of the goods which are being banned for the exports, and they then shift away into other crops. So you end up with a production response quite rationally from farmers shifting into other goods. And some countries like Argentina use export controls very often. They change them very often. By the way, so does Russia. And this must create instability for those farmers and depress the incentive to invest as well. So the longer term consequences are not to safeguard domestic production, actually, if anything, to make it less profitable, which goes in exactly the wrong direction for countries which are interested in promoting food security and reducing import dependence.
So on the one hand, we're hearing social unrest without restrictions, social unrest with restrictions. That's a serious conundrum that we're looking at. And Doa, maybe if I can turn to you, I mean, the underlying motivating factor, I'd say, around this political instability is mostly due to, lack of access, but inflation, right? Spiraling food prices. And we often hear that is the key reason why countries are putting into place these export restrictions. So with your background, I wanted to ask you a very simple question. Is that sound economics? Do you actually have an impact on prices by putting into place these restrictions? And basically, at what cost then for creating further inflationary spirals in the countries which are dependent on those exports?
Thank you very much, Emily, for this excellent question. So are export restrictions sound economics? I think export restrictions are not about economics, they're about politics. Price and the attempt to control price can be as much about economics as about politics. These are measures that are usually taken by governments in a global context deemed unfavorable by them to their own domestic food security. And the export restrictions are put in place to mitigate domestic food security risks. Now, is that the right response? Well, they may provide very temporary relief in a domestic market, but the repercussions are dramatic. They are national and international. Simon went over a lot of these impacts extremely well. So at the national level, what you're doing is you're disincentivizing farmers. It is seriously demoralizing for farmers to be told that they can no longer sell their produce, putting yourself in the shoes of any businessman, being told by your government that you can no longer engage in your international business comes as a shock. It disrupts trade relationships. It leads to export displacement because the importing countries don't sit around and twiddle their fingers until the situation is resolved. They find other suppliers. And the domestic suppliers may find that, whose exports have been restricted, may find the trading relationships impossible to restore. At an international level, it creates panic with a domino effect of export restrictions, one country seeing another and therefore immediately responding with a similar measure. And sooner or later, all those restrictions come back to haunt countries with a rise in global food prices. We've seen that in the 2008 food price crisis, Emily, which was the result of countries panicking due to the financial crisis, biofuels, a combination of factors, and a wave of food export restrictions that set in, with the end result that the FAO World Food Price Index rose by 45%. Simon went over the export restrictions that we've seen in response to this crisis. They have been multiple. They covered over 18% of total traded calories. And they targeted 5 main agricultural crops that constitute 90% of the world's calorific intake. So very serious: wheat, corn, and so on. The other issue that you didn't mention, Emily, which I'd like to put on the table at this conference, is the issue of food stocks. So in addition to countries trying to impose export restrictions to keep food at home, there have also been other approaches to hoarding food, which is to grow your domestic food stock. And that's another big issue at the international level, another very controversial issue. because these stocks are, again, they run counter to the philosophy that countries need to cooperate and need to become interdependent and to manage their interdependence in a healthy way. And instead, countries move into building food stocks that are inefficient. It is very difficult to store food. And with high energy prices, you need to dry your grains before you store them or they will rot. So, you know, it's an extremely costly enterprise and very difficult to manage. Food stocks have distributional impacts, impacts on the governmental budget. They displace the private sector, and they have multiple spillover effects on neighboring and international markets. So I think we need to be discussing all policies to do with hoarding food and urging countries to move in the opposite direction.
Thank you for bringing up the point of public food stockpiling. And I think we'll address that when we get to the question of the outcomes of the ministerial conference of the WTO in a second. But first, I'd like to turn to John, if you'll allow me, because I'd like to know what the EU's view on these food restrictions has been to date, but also food affordability is becoming an increasingly hot potato for governments across the European Union. And I'm wondering, what are the non-trade distorting instruments that can be put into place to keep prices down?
Well, thanks, Emily. Well, on this issue, I think Simon Ebenett hit the nail on the head by saying that the politics and the economics are not in sync when it comes to this element of food security. I mean, the EU, we are in general not supportive of export restrictions in the agriculture and food area. We've made that position pretty clear in the UN, in the G7, the G20, at MC12 a couple of weeks ago, and we are convinced that keeping markets open and avoiding unjustified export restrictions is part of the answer to resilience of markets, although it's only part of the answer. I mean, the trade response is only part of a much bigger response that a multidimensional approach is needed. I mean, particularly on export restrictions, I think we have to, unfortunately, remember that they are allowed under WTO, GATT Article 11. Members may restrict exports to deal with real or impending critical food shortages in an emergency situation. So, we cannot deny that there are situations where export restrictions could be justified. But as Doha has said, we've seen from recent experience that most export restrictions are entirely self-defeating. They exacerbate price increases. They reduce the availability of food. They trigger panic buying and hoarding, what you called a beggar thy neighbor domino effect. We saw this, twice in the last decade or so. And the impact of these measures on net food importing DCs is quite traumatizing. If you ask Egypt, ask Lebanon, ask Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. So in general, I think that they are to be strongly discouraged, although it's a brave politician who is going to say to his population, don't worry, there'll be plenty of food. We're going to allow you to keep exporting your commodities. There's a second issue here, which is a lack of information and transparency surrounding export restrictions. And I doff my cap to Simon with his global trade alert, which is trying to get a handle on a very untransparent area of trade policy. The record in the WTO of notifications of export restrictions is embarrassingly low. We raised this at MC12 a couple of weeks ago, and we will be, from the EU side, really continuing to try and push for improvements in the WTO on transparency and notification of export restrictions, because bottom line is that you cannot make sensible trade policy decisions if you don't have an evidence-based transparency about what's happening on world markets and where restrictions are being imposed. So that's the first thing we need to try to improve and get right in the WTO.
So, I mean, we'll come back. We're going to get start right into the middle of WTO and MC12 and some of those discussions. But first, I'd like to turn to Tatiana on these questions of export restrictions. Simon mentioned that amongst all the measures that have been taken, there have been liberalizing measures. And in that case, we saw Brazil being a bit of an outlier during COVID and lowering its tariffs as a mean to tackle inflation. I mean, many would argue that it's thanks to the country's very high tariff barriers that such a move is possible to start off with, and that's not a possibility for many countries. And we also see that, you know, Brazil is a global food player and might benefit from some of these food restrictions that are being imposed by other exporters around the world. And so I wanted to know basically, what is the position from Brazil, in your view, Tatiana, on these liberalization versus restriction measures that we're seeing?
Emily, you're right. Brazil is setting a good example. And as other panelists mentioned, it makes total economic sense to liberalize instead of imposing export restrictions. There are 3 points that I would like to stress. First, export restrictions are prejudicial to all, actually, including Brazil. Brazil is a net exporter of food with a huge big agricultural trade surplus, actually. But it relies on supply of many of its agricultural inputs. For example, fertilizers mentioned here. Brazil imports 80% of fertilizers that it uses. Second, if agricultural market access negotiations were happening today at the WTO, Brazil would probably have a different position from the one it had a decade ago. Brazil is becoming a strong advocate of free trade and open markets. Last but not least, Brazil wants trade openness, but it is limited in options. It is part of Mercosur, a South American customs union, together with Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And since 2019, Brazil has been trying to convince its partners to reduce the common external tariff of Mercosur, which current average is around 13%, which is huge, right? There was a small reduction, but some partners oppose, major changes and liberalization, notably Argentina. Brazil moved unilaterally with temporary import tariff reductions. However, in the long term, to break the cycle of low economic growth that has been lasted for more than a decade, Mercosur needs to substantially reduce tariff barriers. Thank you.
So a very clear call for Mercosur to further liberalize and lower its external tariffs there. Let's go straight into the WTO. I mean, we saw mid-June, ministers come from around the world to negotiate in Geneva, and amongst the key outcomes of the MC12 was this joint declaration on food security. Members committed to a couple of things, which were avoiding these unjustified export restrictions on food, improving the transparency that John mentioned, but we also saw the pushback that Doha was discussing on the stockpiling. And so, John, allow me to go straight to you. As the EU's top agricultural negotiator, you were in the room, you played an active role in the drafting of this declaration. And I wanted to know, what is, in your view, the key achievement from the EU's perspective, and why are we seeing this pushback on public food stockpiling?
Thanks. That's a lot of questions rolled up in one, but I'll have a go. Well, I mean, the WTO is and remains the cornerstone of our trade policy. I think the fact that we emerged in MC12 with a overall successful outcome is quite extraordinary, given the geopolitical tensions and the general crisis that multilateralism is going through. And I think we played a very big part in that success. The declaration on emergency response to food insecurity is very good. It's got good language, commitments on keeping markets open, on respecting the rules, on exercising restraint on export restrictions, more transparency, support for developing country production capacity, a reference to AMIS as a repository of good monitoring of agri flows. And it also includes a commitment by members to promote the transition to sustainable food systems. That's the first time in the WTO that's recognized, and that did not come easily. We had a lot of negotiations around that. Now, some might say that, well, this is a non-binding political declaration, therefore is of less value. I don't agree with that. I think if we had tried to have a binding decision on all of these food security issues, the text would have been far less ambitious. It would have been very, very narrow in its scope. So I think it's got a far-reaching political commitment that sets the direction for the future. And already in the WTO Agriculture Committee last week, we've started to discuss how to implement this declaration. I think that it was not the only outcome, of course, on agriculture. We have a binding decision on exempting from export restrictions World Food Programme purchases for humanitarian purposes. Again, that's very welcome, something that we've been arguing for a long time, since before Buenos Aires. And I think the important thing here is that the WFP itself has strongly welcomed that decision. So I think the decision, the declaration, shows that the membership of WTO was able to step up to the plate and react to some of the biggest challenges facing us. On agricultural reform more generally, however, I'm a bit disappointed with the lack of an outcome, that we weren't able to launch ambitious new negotiations to reduce trade distorting support. I found myself in a position that would have been inconceivable 20 years ago, working with Australia, Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina, trying to get an ambitious outcome at MC12 on subsidies. But the positions of the members on this issue have not evolved in the last few years. The differences were far too big, and the gaps could not be bridged. And I think the issue of public stockholding proved to be the big dividing point in the membership. And at the end of the day, Brazil and Australia in particular saw too many big risks in launching negotiations on this subject, which in their view, in their calculus, could lead to a kind of backsliding, giving some kind of multilateral blessing to subsidy schemes designed as PSH schemes. Last point is, what's interesting in a way is that for the first time since at least 1990, agriculture was not the litmus test of the success or failure of a WTO ministerial. We had a very modest successful outcome on the declaration decision, nothing much on reform. So in a way, it was, as Sherlock Holmes said, it was the dog that did not bark in the night on this occasion. And we picked ourselves up now, we dust down our clothes, and we will continue to negotiate agriculture based on the existing mandates that we've got.
So actually, that's a great segue for us there, John, to Doha. So, I mean, we saw that agriculture is now one of the main elements that is going to continue to be discussed, continue to be negotiated. That it's an active, there's active movement, including on the question of subsidies. I'll put it simply, what are the next steps now at WTO level to tackle food insecurity, but also look at the way that we can improve markets and agricultural markets internationally?
Thank you, Emily. So first of all, in terms of where the WTO rulebook stands on export restrictions, we have a combination of rules, whether within the Agreement on Agriculture or within GATT itself. So this issue is as old as GATT. And basically those rules, whether in the Agreement on Agriculture or in GATT, try to balance two things: recognizing the right of countries to restrict exports of critical foodstuffs in situations of emergencies, but also the needs of food importing countries. So they established that a certain amount of advance notice is needed, a certain amount of consultation is needed, so that countries that depend on your food are not cut off without prior notice. Now at MC12, I think the success at MC12 was that the need to avoid export restrictions was reaffirmed by all WTO members. And of course, that historic decision on the World Food Programme that John mentioned. And incidentally, the World Food Programme had reported to the WTO that its cost of doing business since this crisis started had risen by 40%. After MC12, they reported in the WTO that the decision that was taken at MC12 was able to unblock a whole shipment of grain from India to the program. So MC12 outcomes have had a real impact and an almost immediate one, and we're really very pleased to see that. Emily, I would just say that the issue of export restrictions is one that goes directly, in particular food export restrictions, goes directly to the credibility of the multilateral trading system. If you're a food importing country and at a time of emergency, the trading system isn't there for you, you're not going to get your food, you're not going to want to support that trading system or to be a very active or vocal participant in it. And so I think this is one issue, this is the one issue that is seriously capable of reducing faith in this trading system. We haven't spoken about fertilizers in this webinar, but fertilizer export restrictions had also kicked in, of course, in the wake of this crisis. Now, what we need to do is to strengthen what we adopted at MC12. We did that, but it's not enough. I think, if we can go further, the further we can go, and sort of, stabilizing the rules, in making the rules more transparent, in giving importing countries a bit more rights, given that they are willing to invest in the trading system. And, if we're asking countries to not be self-sufficient and to not hoard food, then we have to give them an alternative. So the more we make that alternative work, the better off, we are, and the better off the credibility of WTO. But I think the next steps in terms of actions by the WTO, I would say it's continuing the agricultural reform agenda. And that's because we need to be producing food where it is most efficient to do so, not only because the world is in need of a lot more food, but because of environmental reasons too. So I'm Egyptian, and the United Nations Development Program has told Egypt multiple times that if Egypt were to aim for food self-sufficiency, it would need 3 river Niles, not 1. So, for environmental reasons, we need to be trading in food, and we need to be allowing food to be produced where it is efficient to do so, and not behind tariff walls or subsidies. Last point, Emily, food production is very concentrated and exports are very concentrated. And we need to, once we reduce the trade barriers that are in part contributing to concentration, we would be better off. Today, no more than 10 countries export 100% of world soy, 10 countries, 90% of world wheat, 10 countries, 70% of world meat, 10 countries, 90% of world rice. I think this is a perilous situation, and it's in part driven by protectionism. Food is concentrated where the protectionism is, and we really need to be expanding where we produce our food. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, talking about a functioning trading system, it's not possible to do that without talking about SPS. There was an outcome on SPS also during MC12, and here it takes us back to the role and the function of the 3 sisters. So that's Codex, the OIE, and IPPC. Tatiana, turning to you, what do you see as the role of these institutions now, also in their regulatory roles in limiting the systemic shocks and contributing to food security?
Thank you, Emily. WTO has a huge role as a guardian of a rules-based, liberalized multilateral trade system. And the WTO and the 3 sisters that you mentioned, the Codex Alimentarius Commission, the World Organization for Animal Health, and the International Plant Protection Convention have a crucial role in ensuring fair practices in food trade and facilitating trade through establishment of international standards for food based on scientific and risk-based analysis. There are several negotiations over important standards actually stalled at Codex, some for over a decade. It is important to move quickly with the adoption of international standards because developing and least developed countries rely on them as reference points for food safety. Food systems, as we know, are facing unprecedented challenges as natural resources are limited and climate change is increasingly affecting food production. Technology and innovation are the only solutions actually for feeding the global population. And we need international standards for food that reflect technological change. And policymakers may have their consumers' best interest in heart, but we need to follow science and technology. Some policy experiments can be actually disastrous. John mentioned Sri Lanka, and I want to mention it also as one of the most striking examples. 2 years ago, the government mandated organic farming and prohibited imports of fertilizers. Now this middle-income country that used to be self-sufficient in rice and had a prosperous exporting industry, food industry, is experiencing an economic catastrophe and food riots. Its productivity dropped dramatically, and it now needs to import food. So I will finish saying that main global players may disagree about national policies when it comes to food, but they must find common sense when focusing on facilitating global food trade and joining forces in this, again, unprecedented fight to reduce poverty and food insecurity. Thank you.
Thanks, Tatiana. We have a very little time left, and I do want to take lots of questions, but I want to turn to Simon on one of the points that has not been raised so far. And there's so many other aspects of this debate. We could have another series of these because of the complexity of this discussion. But I really wanted to go to you, Simon, on one of the key elements that we haven't been discussing, which is the role of decoupling agricultural trade from financial speculation. Would that help improve food security?
I think the answer to that would be no, because we need to have financial markets in agriculture so that farmers can hedge. And if farmers are going to hedge, someone has to be on the other side of that financial transaction with a different view of the world. And if that different view of the world, some people might call that speculation, it might be insight. I must say, in preparing for this session, I looked into whether or not there was much evidence of speculation this time around, and I couldn't find a smoking gun.
Right, great. So we're ready for some questions now. I have here a question. So for who wants to take it? Do we expect a push in subsidies now to develop more local food production worldwide, especially in import-dependent countries? And I will add to that question, is there a possibility that such subsidies will be trade distorting? Go ahead, Simon.
The answer is we are already seeing it, and we've been documenting it. There is a push for increasing subsidies, almost certainly, and these are tradable goods, so there is going to be some fallout for trade. So I think we get back to what's the balance between the right policies towards consumption of food and production of food that develop that to generate some degree of food security without massively distorting global markets. And I think that challenge is there, and I think we're still struggling with it.
Coming back to the distortions in world markets, there's a question here for Doa that was mentioning the hoarding element, and we have a number of people here, and particularly Bartos on the line, who would like to know, what are the countries that you pinpoint who have been most hoarding?
So that's delicate, of course. I don't want to go into sort of mentioning country names, but a number of countries, and I would say in all regions, the issue of food stocks is now being discussed. So I think it's something we need to be careful with, basically, in particular, because we don't have examples at the international level of food stocks that have functioned very well. We don't have positive examples. There have always been problems with the idea of stocking food. I just want to add to Simon's answer, Emily, to that question on subsidies. So whether the G20 or the WTO, I think all policymakers are reaffirming that whatever measures are taken in response to this emergency or to the COVID emergency that we just had, the measures need to be targeted, proportional, temporary, and you will find that sort of a standard set of, adjectives that are added to these measures, whether in G20 declarations or in the WTO decision at MC12. And really the idea is that we just need to be careful that as we introduce these measures in this emergency context, they don't become permanent distortions to trade.
As part of those measures, and coming back to one of John's earlier points, we have a question here as to whether the WTO Secretariat should be running a kind of formal reminder process to people or to different countries on the criteria that they should be using in order to distinguish what constitutes a restriction or not.
Is that a question to me?
Transparency, notification, I mean, in that big box, what are the next steps?
Well, no, certainly the Secretariat can be very helpful in shedding a light on members' practices if they're allowed to do that. And one of the problems we've had for the last 20 years in the WTO is the notion that it's a member-driven organisation, and therefore the Secretariat should not get its hands dirty in these sort of policy areas. I hope that as part of the WTO reform process, which has been launched at MC12, that will give more scope for the Secretariat, which is a group of very brilliant people, to actually be a bit more outspoken, if you like, and be mandated to support members in the areas that we've been talking about, so that it can be a bit more like the OECD in terms of the supporting role that it provides to the membership.
So a more outspoken WTO, and in that, maybe we need to clarify some of the rules. Here we have a question as to whether rural infrastructure development subsidies, particularly in developing countries, should be considered green or amber box. Anyone ready to take that question?
Well, I think they are considered development box and they are authorized. They are authorized by WTO. There's a lot of, we call it policy space. There's a lot of policy space under the WTO agreement on agriculture for countries to use subsidies in a healthy way to promote research and development under the green box, or to promote rural infrastructure under what we call the development box. All of that, there are lots of types of subsidies that are already authorized.
So there's going to be a lot more discussion on subsidies, on financial markets, on innovation and technology. We have our time coming to a close today. So I just wanted to, on behalf of ECIPE, the European Centre for International Political Economy, thank you all. It's been a great pleasure to have time to discuss whether open markets contribute to food security. We can see that there are many more elements to this discussion. Maybe we will have to organise further debates on it. I would like to particularly thank our exceptional speakers for joining this conversation today, and to the great team at ECIPE for all the hard work in making this webinar possible. So we hope to see you very soon for a new debate.
Thanks to you too, Emily.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.